The first time my son tapped his coffee mug 3 times against the rim of the saucer, I almost didn't catch it. I was reaching for the cream. My wife was laughing at something his fiancé had said. The kitchen smelled like cinnamon rolls because that's what Margaret always made when company stayed the night, and I was tired from a long week of running numbers for a divorce case in Tulsa. I almost missed it. That's the part I keep coming back to even now, 2 years later. I almost missed the one signal that mattered. My name doesn't matter much for the telling, but I'll say it anyway because the man I was before that Sunday morning is not exactly the man I am now. Augustin Boyd, 61 years old. Forensic accountant for 34 years, mostly working out of a brick office building off Cherry Street in Tulsa, Oklahoma. I spent my career untangling people's financial lies. Divorces, embezzlement, family trusts where somebody had quietly bled the account dry over a decade. I could look at a bank statement the way a doctor looks at an x-ray. I knew the shape of fraud the way other men know the shape of a baseball card collection. What I'm telling you is, I should have caught it sooner. The fact that I didn't is something I've made peace with, but not entirely. My son's name is Holden. He was 34 that fall. He'd been divorced almost 2 years from a woman named Bree, which had been hard on him in the way first marriages ending in your early 30s are hard, where you walk around for about 8 months not really inside your own body. Margaret and I worried about him. We worried out loud to each other in the kitchen at night, the way parents do when their grown children are hurting and there's nothing they can pack into a lunchbox to fix it. When Holden called us in late August and said he'd met someone, we were so relieved we almost didn't ask questions. That was the first mistake. But I'm jumping ahead. Her name was Maribel Quinones. She was 31, originally from Albuquerque, working as a regional sales rep for a medical device company that supposedly sold orthopedic equipment to hospitals across the Midwest. Holden met her at a charity 5K in Bricktown back in June. By Labor Day, they were exclusive. By Halloween, she'd moved into his condo in Brookside. By Thanksgiving, they were engaged. That's 4 months. 4 months from meeting to a ring. I want you to hold that number in your head, because later it becomes important. Margaret and I met her once before the engagement at a barbecue at Holden's place in late September. She was lovely. That's the word I kept using when Margaret asked me afterward what I thought. Lovely. She had this way of asking questions that made you feel listened to in a deep way, like she was actually filing your answers somewhere important. She remembered that Margaret had taught 4th grade for 22 years, and asked her about specific kids Margaret had mentioned in passing weeks before. She remembered that I liked old jazz records and brought me a sealed copy of a Dave Brubeck album she'd found at an antique mall in Edmond. I should have caught it then. The thoughtfulness was too clean. In my line of work, I've learned that the best con artists don't act suspicious. They act considerate. They give you exactly the small kindnesses your wife has been forgetting to give you, and you find yourself thinking, well, this person sees me. But Holden was happy, and we were tired of watching him be sad. So we said she was lovely, and we meant it the way parents mean things they want to be true. The engagement was announced over a phone call. Holden told us Maribel had been transferred to manage a new territory and they wanted to get married quick, before her schedule got crazy. He wanted to bring her home for Thanksgiving so we could really get to know her. Margaret cried. I told him we were proud. We hung up. Margaret turned to me at the kitchen table and said, Augustin, 4 months. I said, I know. She said, should we say something? I said, no. Let them come. Let me watch them in our house. That was the closest I came to catching it early. Letting them come into our house where I could see her in a different light, surrounded by Holden's actual life, the life he'd grown up in. Now I have to tell you about the signal, because if I don't tell you about the signal, the rest of this won't make sense. When Holden was 8 years old, we had a neighbor named Mr. Talbot. He lived 2 doors down. He was retired military, widowed, and he used to invite the neighborhood kids over to see his model trains in the basement. Holden loved going. He'd come home with stories about the little towns Mr. Talbot had built, the painted figures, the working lights. One Saturday, Holden came home from Mr. Talbot's white-faced and quiet. He wouldn't talk to Margaret. He wouldn't talk to me. He went upstairs and shut his door. By that evening, I'd gotten enough out of him to understand that Mr. Talbot had done something. Not the worst thing, but something that scared my son. Something with hands on shoulders that lingered too long, and a door that closed when Holden didn't expect it to. We did everything we were supposed to do. We called the police. We talked to the other parents. Mr. Bust. Talbot moved out 3 months later. Holden saw a counselor for almost a year. But the thing that stayed with me, that stayed with both of us, was that Holden had not known how to tell us. He'd been at Mr. Talbot's house for over an hour after the moment. He'd sat there frozen, eating cookies, smiling, because he was 8 years old and he didn't know what to do. After all that, I sat with him on the back porch one night that summer. I said, "Holden, if you're ever in a place where something feels wrong and you can't say it out loud, I want you to give me a sign, just so I know to come get you, just so I know to pay attention." He thought about it. He said, "What kind of sign?" I said, "Anything. You pick." He picked up his glass of lemonade and tapped it 3 times against the wooden arm of his chair. 3 quiet taps, he said, like that, so nobody else has to know. We practiced it for about a week. He tapped 3 times at the dinner table, just for fun, and I'd put down my fork and say, "I see you, son." It became a little game. Then it faded, the way things do when life keeps happening and the bad thing recedes. I hadn't thought about the 3 taps in 25 years. I genuinely had not thought about it. If you'd asked me the week before Thanksgiving whether my son and I had any secret signal, I would have said no. That's the part I want you to understand. The signal had been sitting in my son's body for a quarter century, waiting. They drove up from Tulsa on the Wednesday afternoon before Thanksgiving. Margaret had been cooking since Tuesday. The house smelled like sage and brown butter. Maribel had brought a bouquet of orange dahlias for Margaret and a bottle of single malt scotch for me, the brand I drank, which I'd mentioned exactly once on the phone 6 weeks earlier. I noticed that. I noticed it the way you notice a coin on the sidewalk. Not enough to stop walking. The 4 of us had dinner that night at the kitchen table. Maribel told stories about her job: hospital procurement, medical device sales, contracts in Wichita and Springfield and Little Rock. She used acronyms naturally. She knew the names of the right companies. When I asked, mildly, what her territory's annual revenue was, she gave me a number that was plausible and a margin that was plausible, and a story about a difficult buyer in St. Louis that was, to my ear, just a little too clean. I'm a forensic accountant. I've heard 10,000 stories from people lying to me about money. Lies have a texture. They are too smooth or too rough. They are too detailed in the wrong places. Maribel's story about St. Louis was too detailed in the wrong places. She named the hospital. She named the buyer. She named the dollar amount of the contract. Real salespeople, in my experience, don't talk like that at dinner with strangers. They tell you about the weird food they ate or the rental car that broke down. They don't recite numbers. But Margaret was charmed. Holden was glowing. I told myself I was looking too hard. After dinner, Maribel offered to help with the dishes. Margaret waved her off and told her to relax. Maribel insisted. She and Margaret stood at the sink together, and from the kitchen table I could hear them talking, the easy back and forth of 2 women getting to know each other. I heard Maribel say, "Holden mentioned you all might be downsizing in a few years. Have you been thinking about Florida or somewhere closer to family?" Margaret laughed. She said, "Oh, we're not going anywhere. Augustin's still working, and the house is paid off. We'd be foolish to sell." There was a small pause. Then Maribel said, "That's wonderful. Most of my parents' friends are still carrying mortgages into their 70s. It's a different generation." Margaret said something about being lucky. The dishes clinked. I sat at the table and felt the back of my neck get cold. A salesperson does not, in the first conversation with her fiancé's mother, fish for whether the house is paid off. She doesn't, on the second meeting, ever, casually probe net worth. That's not charm, that's reconnaissance. I got up and went to my office. I shut the door. I sat down at my computer. I want to be honest with you. At this point, I had nothing. A scotch she'd remembered. A story with too many numbers. A question to Margaret that could have been small talk in any other mouth. If I'd brought this to Margaret, she'd have told me I was being paranoid, and she'd have been right to say it, based on what I had. But what I had wasn't evidence. It was instinct. And after 34 years of looking at financial crimes, my instinct had earned the right to be listened to. I pulled up the Secretary of State's website for New Mexico. I searched for Maribel Quinones. Nothing relevant. I searched for the medical device company she'd named. The company existed. It was real. But when I looked at their employee directory, which was public for the sales team, Maribel was not on it. I sat back. I told myself there were 100 reasons a name might not be on a public directory. Maybe she was new. Maybe the directory was outdated. Maybe she went by a different name professionally. I called a friend of mine, a man named Otis Whitmer, who runs background checks for a private investigations firm out of Oklahoma City. Otis owed me a favor from a forensic case I'd handed him in 2019. I asked him if he could quietly run a check on Maribel Diane Quinones, age 31, last known address Albuquerque. I told him I needed it by Friday morning. He said he'd see what he could do. Then I went back out to the living room and watched my son sit on the couch with his arm around his fiancée, and I smiled, and I asked her about her family in Albuquerque, and I listened to her answers, and I noticed that when I asked her what her father did for a living, she said, "He passed away when I was 16, and the way she said it was perfect. Just sad enough. Just brave enough." And I felt sick to my stomach, because the perfectness of her sadness was, to me, the final tell. Real grief is awkward. It comes out wrong. It comes out at the wrong moments. Performed grief is graceful. I went to bed that night and lay awake. Margaret rolled over and asked me what was wrong. I said I was just thinking about a case. She kissed my shoulder and went back to sleep. Thanksgiving morning, Holden and I went out to the garage to bring in some folding chairs for the table. While we were out there, I asked him, casual as I could make it, how the wedding planning was going. He said, "Good. Maribel's handling most of it. She found a venue in Sedona." I said, "Sedona's expensive." He said, "Yeah, but she said her firm gives her a wedding bonus when she gets married. Some weird retention thing." I said, "A wedding bonus." He said, "I know it sounds weird." She showed me the paperwork. I said, "How much?" He said, 40 grand. I said, "And the venue costs?" He said, "About 60. I let that hang. I picked up the chairs. He said, "Dad." "What?" I said, "Nothing. I'm just an old accountant." The math made me curious. He looked at me for a second. He's a smart kid. He's always been smart, and I could see him doing the subtraction. 40 against 60, the $20,000 gap. He said, "We're splitting the difference." I said, "Okay." He picked up the rest of the chairs and we walked back into the house. He didn't say anything else. But I'd planted a small seed and I knew it would grow whether he wanted it to or not. Thanksgiving dinner was at 3 o'clock. Margaret had made a turkey and a ham because that's what her mother had always done, and we had the dining room set with the good china that came out twice a year. Margaret's sister Eileen and her husband Roy had driven down from Bartlesville. Eileen brought 2 pies. Roy brought a bottle of wine. The table was full. Maribel was charming. She praised Margaret's stuffing. She asked Eileen about her grandchildren. She told Roy a funny story about a cousin who'd tried to deep fry a turkey and burned down a carport. The whole table laughed. I watched her work the room. That's the only way to describe what I was watching. She was working the room. Every laugh she got, every story she remembered, every name she repeated back was part of a process I have watched dozens of con artists execute over my career. They are not evil-looking people. They are warm. They make you feel chosen. That is the entire job. We were on the pie course when it happened. Eileen had been asking Holden about his job, which is contract law for an energy company, and Holden had been explaining a deal he was working on involving mineral rights down near Ardmore. Maribel was listening, smiling, holding her coffee mug. Eileen said, "Holden, your dad was telling me he closed a big case last month, the Vandermeer thing." This was true. I had finished a long forensic engagement involving a family business in Bartlesville. The fees had been substantial. I had not, in fact, told Eileen anything about it, but Margaret might have mentioned it in passing on the phone. Maribel turned her head just slightly toward me. She said, "Oh, what was that one?" I said mildly. "Just a family business dispute, long running. Credit's done." She said, "How long do those usually take?" I said, "Depends." She said, "And does the fee scale with the time, or is it a flat engagement?" I said, "Depends on the client." There was a tiny pause, the kind a fish makes when it touches a hook, and then let's go." Maribel laughed lightly. She said, "Sorry, the sales rep in me is always trying to figure out how other people get paid." The table laughed. Margaret patted my hand. Holden smiled into his pie, and then I heard it. 3 small taps. A coffee mug against the rim of a saucer. My son was sitting across from me. He was looking down at his plate. His right hand was on the table, and he was tapping his mug. Tap, tap, tap. I went still. It took me a full 3 seconds to remember what the sound meant. 3 seconds of thinking, why is he doing that? What is he? And then it broke over me the way memory sometimes does. All at once, with the back porch and the lemonade glass and an 8-year-old boy who didn't have words. He'd remembered. He'd remembered before I did. I looked at him. He didn't look up. He just tapped one more time, deliberately, slowly, and then set the mug down. I said, "Holden, would you come help me with something in the garage real quick?" He said, "Sure, Dad." We left the table. Maribel watched us go. I could feel her watching. In the garage with the door shut, I said, "Tell me." He sat down on the workbench. He put his face in his hands. He said, "Dad, I don't know. I don't know if I'm crazy." I said, "You're not crazy. Tell me what you know." He said, 3 weeks ago, her ex-boyfriend called me. He found my number somehow. He said she'd done this before. He said she'd taken him for almost $200,000 over a year, and he was just trying to warn me. I thought he was bitter. I thought he was lying. I told her about the call. She cried. She showed me bank statements. She showed me her tax returns. They all looked clean. I felt awful for doubting her. I said, "How clean did they look?" He said, "Real clean." I said, "That's the problem." He said, "Dad, I didn't know what to do. She has a key to my place. She has access to my checking account because I added her last month to pay for some wedding stuff." I started getting these feelings, little things. She told me her dad died when she was 16, but on her LinkedIn profile from years ago she'd posted on Father's Day 3 years ago, before 16 would have been. I checked the math. She would have been 28. I said, "Jesus, Holden." He said, "I didn't know. I didn't know if I was making mountains out of molehills. I was going to talk to you this weekend. And then she asked you about your fees, and my hand went to the mug and I didn't even think about it. I just remembered." I said, okay, listen to me. You are not crazy. I have been watching her since she walked in this house, and I have been listening to her since dinner last night, and I think she is exactly what you're afraid she is. But we need to be smart. We need proof, not feelings. He said, "What do I do?" I said, "You go back inside. You finish dessert. You smile. You take her home tomorrow and you act normal. You do not change the locks. You do not freeze the account. You do not confront her. You give me 5 days. He said, 5 days. I said, 5 days. I have a friend in Oklahoma City. I have a guy in Albuquerque I can call. I will know exactly who she is by Tuesday. He looked at me. He was 34 years old, a grown man with his own law degree and his own condo and his own life. And he looked at me the way he'd looked at me when he was 8, which is to say, he looked at me like I was the answer. He said, "Dad, I'm sorry I brought her here." I said, "Don't be sorry. You tapped the mug. That's all I needed." We went back inside. We finished pie. Maribel asked lightly what we'd been talking about, and I said the garage door was sticking and I'd needed Holden to help me with the spring. She nodded. She smiled. Margaret refilled the coffee. I watched my son's hand on the table, and I thought about all the years between the porch and that dining room. All the years that signal had been quietly sleeping in him, waiting to be needed. The next 5 days were the hardest of my professional life, and I have testified against organized crime. I called Otis in Oklahoma City first thing Friday morning. He'd already started digging. By Friday afternoon, he'd confirmed that Maribel Diane Quinones did not work for the medical device company she'd named. The company had never had an employee by that name. She had, however, been listed as an employee of 3 different small businesses in 3 different states over the past 6 years, each for less than 18 months. He couldn't get me much more without paying for a deeper background check, so I authorized it. I called my contact in Albuquerque, a woman named Petra Holloway who'd done some witness work for me a decade ago. Petra spent the weekend asking around. By Sunday, she called me back and said, "Augustin, this woman has another name." I said, "Tell me." She said she was born Marisol Diane Quinones Vargas. She legally changed her name to Maribel Quinones in 2019. Before that, she was the subject of a civil suit in Bernalillo County over a fraudulent power of attorney scheme involving an elderly man she was caring for. The suit was settled out of court. No criminal charges were filed. The man's family signed an NDA. She left the state shortly after. I sat at my desk. I closed my eyes. I said, "Petra, you are getting a Christmas card from me every year for the rest of my life." She said, "I'll take a bottle of bourbon and we'll call it even." Monday, I had Otis pull every available record on the bank accounts I could legally look at. I had Holden very quietly get me read access to his joint account. I went through the transactions for the past 6 weeks. There were 3 transfers I didn't like. Small ones. $300, $400, $500. All to a Venmo account labeled MQ Personal. All on days when Holden had been out of town for work. The transactions were spaced out enough to look incidental. They were not incidental. They were the testing the fence transactions. The ones you make when you're learning what the other person notices and what they don't. She was building towards something. The wedding bonus story was almost certainly the setup for a much larger transfer. The Sedona venue was the cover. There was no wedding bonus. There was Holden signing a check for $60,000 to a venue that was very possibly a shell company or a real venue she would simply never book. Tuesday night I called Holden. I told him what I had. He was quiet for a long time. He said, "Dad, I want to be there when you tell her." I said, "No, son, I want to be there when you tell her." He said, "Okay." We met Wednesday morning at his condo. Maribel was at what she'd said was a sales meeting in Wichita. I let myself in with Holden. We sat down at his kitchen table with the documents. Otis had pulled together a clean file, the original name, the Albuquerque suit, the fake employer, the Venmo transfers, the LinkedIn timeline that contradicted her father's death story. Holden read it all without saying a word. When he finished, he set the folder down. He said, "Dad, how did I not see this?" I said, "Because she is a professional, and because you wanted to be in love. Neither of those is a sin." He said, "What do I do?" I said, "You decide. I will sit in this kitchen as long as you need me to. But this part is yours." He thought about it for almost 20 minutes. He drank a glass of water. He walked around the living room. He looked at a framed photograph of the two of them at the charity 5K where they'd met. He said, "I want her out of here today. I want her out of the account today. I want her out of my life today. And I want her to know I know." I said, "Then that's what we do." We called a locksmith and had the locks changed by noon. Holden called his bank and removed her access. He drafted a letter, a short one, that explained exactly what he knew and what would happen if she contacted him or his family again. He attached a redacted copy of the Albuquerque records. He printed it. He folded it. He set it on the kitchen counter with her key. She came back from Wichita at 4. She tried her key. It didn't work. She knocked. Holden opened the door. He did not let her in. I was sitting in the living room where she could see me through the doorway. He said, "Marisol." That was all. He said her real name. She didn't react the way an innocent person reacts. An innocent person looks confused. A guilty person looks like the building they've been standing in has just collapsed. Her face did something I have seen exactly twice before in courtrooms. It went still. Not surprised, not angry, just still, in the way a face goes still when somebody has been operating a complicated machine for a long time and the machine is finally stopped. She said, "Holden, let me explain." He said, "Your things are in 2 boxes on the porch. The letter on top tells you what I know. If you contact me, my parents, my aunt and uncle, my friends, or anyone you met through me, this file goes to the Bernalillo County DA on Monday. If you disappear, the file stays in my safe. That's the deal." She stood there. She looked at me through the door. I looked back. I did not smile or scowl. I just looked. She picked up the boxes. She walked to her car. She drove away. We did not see her again. The DA file went into Holden's safe, and as far as I know, it is still there. Some part of me wanted her prosecuted. Some part of me wanted a parade of restitution and consequence. But Holden made a different choice. and it was his to make. He said he didn't want to spend the next 2 years of his life in depositions. He said he wanted to spend them healing. I understood that. I respect it still. Holden drove home with me to Margaret's that night. The three of us sat at the kitchen table where she'd asked about the mortgage. Margaret cried. Holden cried. I think I cried too, though I'd be the last to admit it. We ate leftover stuffing at 11 o'clock at night, the three of us, because nobody could think of what else to do. At some point Margaret asked Holden how he'd known to do the signal. He said he hadn't known. He said his hand had just done it. The body remembering what the mind had filed away. That's what I keep coming back to. That's the part I want anyone who hears this to understand. The body remembers. The signal we taught my son when he was 8 years old, when neither of us could have imagined a woman like Marisol Quiñones Vargas existing in our lives, sat dormant in him for 25 years and woke up at exactly the right moment. I tell people now when the subject comes up at parties that every family should have a signal, not because the world is full of con artists, although it is, but because there are moments in every life when something is wrong and we don't have the words for it, and the people who love us are sitting right across the table and we need a way to say without saying. Pick something small, a tap, a phrase, a way of holding a glass. Teach it to your kids when they're young. Teach it to your spouse. Don't make a big production of it. Just plant it. Let it sit in the body. Some signals never get used, and that's a kind of grace. But some signals wait 25 years to save a life, and when that day comes, you'll be very glad you took the time, on some forgotten porch, on some forgotten summer evening, to ask a child what he'd like the secret to be. My son is married now, by the way, to a woman named Greta who teaches middle school music in Tulsa. She is not graceful in her grief. She is awkward in it, in the right way. She forgets things and laughs at the wrong moments and burns the rolls every single Thanksgiving. We love her completely. And sometimes when we're all sitting around the table, I'll catch Holden looking at me across the cranberry sauce. He'll smile. He'll pick up his coffee. And he'll tap very softly one time, just one, against the saucer. It means everything is fine. It means, I see you, Dad. It means thank you. I tap back. I've thought a lot in the years since about why my son was able to do what he did at that dinner table, and the answer I keep arriving at has nothing to do with luck. It has to do with a small choice I made on a back porch in the summer of 1998 when an 8-year-old boy was hurting and I didn't know how to help him except to ask him what symbol he wanted to share with me. That choice was a seed. I planted it without knowing what tree it would grow into. 25 years later, the tree shaded my son when a storm came. That's the way cause and effect actually works in a life. Not in a straight line, not in the dramatic, instant way movies show it. It works slowly, through small acts of attention, through the things we do for our children when nothing in particular is at stake. Maribel did not appear in our lives by accident, but she also did not catch us unprepared by accident. Holden was prepared because a quarter-century earlier I had taken the time to listen to him after a bad afternoon at a neighbor's house. Every decent thing that protected him at that Thanksgiving dinner had been quietly building for years. I think about character a lot now. I think about the 3 things I tried imperfectly to give my son. The first is honesty, by which I mean the willingness to say what you actually see, even when it costs you. Holden tapped that mud because he had been raised in a house where noticing things was not punished. The second is wisdom, which I have come to believe is just attention practiced over time. Holden noticed the discrepancy in Maribel's father's death, not because he was clever, but because he had been taught that small things matter and contradictions are worth checking. And the third is the one I value most, which is the steadiness to act on what you know. Wisdom without nerve is just regret in slow motion. Holden had nerve. He sat at that table with a woman he had loved, and he tapped the mug anyway. If you take anything from what I've told you, let it be this. Be honest with the children in your life when they are small. Listen to them even when their problem seems trivial. Give them a way to reach you that doesn't require words, because there will be moments in their lives when the words won't come. And when you fail at any of this, which you will because I certainly did many times, simply try again the next morning. The mug taps 3 times. The hand remembers what the mind forgot. The seed planted on the porch grows tall enough to shade the next generation. This is not magic. This is the slow, patient mechanics of love doing its work in the dark. And when the moment comes, you will be ready, because the work was done long before you knew you'd need it.